The story has changed, but the stakes are still very high for Dricus du Plessis and Israel Adesanya at UFC 305. Now, I'm very fascinated by this fight because the original story, which we're going to get into a little bit later in this video, but the original story has changed, but here we are still getting ready for a highly anticipated matchup between two of the best middleweights in the world, the current champion, Dricus du Plessis, and the former champion, Israel Adesanya. This fight reminds me of UFC 79, Chuck Liddell versus Wanderlei Silva. That was a fight where the original story had changed, but it was still a highly anticipated matchup. Chuck Liddell was the UFC light heavyweight champion, and Wanderlei Silva was the Pride 205-pound middleweight champion. For a long time, people had wanted to see these two guys fight. They had wanted to see the best guy in the UFC fight against the best guy in Pride and find out who's the best 205-pound fighter on the planet. That was the fight that everyone wanted to see. Time was the enemy of that fight, because had the fight been made at, let's say, UFC 59 as opposed to UFC 79, the story would have been completely different and the fight would have meant so much more. The stakes would have been so much higher. Chuck Liddell was the undisputed UFC light heavyweight champion at that time. Wanderlei Silva was the undisputed Pride 205-pound middleweight champion at that time. But so much time had passed that by the time we get to UFC 79, Chuck Liddell is on a 2-fight losing streak, and Wanderlei Silva is on a 2-fight losing streak. Chuck Liddell is no longer the UFC light heavyweight champion. Wanderlei Silva is no longer the Pride middleweight champion. Chuck Liddell had lost the UFC light heavyweight championship to Quentin Rampage Jackson at UFC 71. Wanderlei Silva had lost his Pride middleweight title to Dan Henderson at Pride 33. Chuck Liddell had also lost a fight to Keith Jardine, and Wanderlei Silva had also lost a fight to Mirko Cro Cop in the Pride Openweight Grand Prix that Cro Cop eventually went on and won. So by the time we get to UFC 79, it's no longer about who's the number one guy in the world. It's no longer about the UFC versus Pride. It's no longer about number one versus number two and who's truly the best guy. It's now about the matchup, which is another reason why people wanted to see that fight, is because the matchup was so good. Here's two guys who are strikers. Here's two guys who love knocking people out. It's a great fight on paper. And that was the only reason that kept this fight going, was that it was a great matchup. And also that people had wanted to see it for so long that we just had to see it when the UFC bought Pride. So there was a little bit of that to it, but it was also what kept it going on was, let's just find out who's the best between these two guys. Forget about who's the best in the world. We're going to have Dan Henderson and Quentin Rampage Jackson fight at UFC 75 to determine that. But let's find out who's the best guy between Chuck Liddell and Wanderlei Silva. Let's find that out at UFC 79. And the fight was no longer a main event. It was the co-main event on that card. The fight meant a lot to a lot of people, but it really didn't mean as much as it could have meant had they fought, like I mentioned earlier, at UFC 59. Had they fought then, when both guys were holding their titles and both guys were on these long winning streaks and both guys were knocking everybody out, the fight would have been totally different and the stakes would have been so much higher. This fight between Dricus du Plessis and Israel Adesanya has a lot of that in it, where yes, the fight still means a lot, but the stakes are different. The original story of who's the true African champion or the real African champion, or Dricus du Plessis disrespecting the three kings of African MMA, Francis Ngannou, Kamaru Usman, and Israel Adesanya, that whole storyline, which we don't really need to get into, that's been done to death, and we don't really need to get into that whole story, but you remember the storyline. And there was this great build-up that we were leading into. After Dricus du Plessis beat Robert Whittaker, there was that face-off in the center of the octagon during the post-fight interview, and Israel Adesanya and Dricus du Plessis came face-to-face for the first time, and it really got people excited about this fight, more so than they already were. I mean, this has been a fight that's been building for a long time, and a lot of people were really anticipating this fight. But that moment in the cage, that really got people excited. Like I mentioned earlier with Chuck Liddell and Wanderlei Silva, time has been the biggest enemy of this fight. Because had the fight been made when Adesanya fought against Sean Strickland, had Dricus du Plessis not gotten injured, we're talking about a completely different storyline and a completely different level of excitement for that fight. The stakes are still very high. A lot of the original stuff is still intact. A lot of stuff that was still on the table back when Adesanya confronted Dricus du Plessis after du Plessis beat Robert Whittaker. A lot of that is still on the table. This is still a world title fight. This is still going to be taking place in a main event on a UFC pay-per-view. This is still a grudge match. All the stuff that normally makes people excited about fights are still intact. The one problem with this fight, and why it ties back to Chuck Liddell and Wanderlei Silva and this time issue, is because Israel Adesanya lost to Sean Strickland. When that happened, that really hurt the storyline and hurt the stakes of this fight. Now, of course, the stakes are still very high, and this is still a highly anticipated matchup, and I'm sure it's going to do great numbers on pay-per-view, but it could have been so much bigger. The build-up to this fight could have been so much better. Now, the one reason, and the one reason only, why time has hurt this fight is because, let's go back to that original story. The original storyline of Dricus du Plessis talking about how he'll be a true African champion, someone who lives in South Africa, lives and trains in Africa, breathes the African air. That whole story that we don't need to rehash, but you remember that story. That storyline was the main selling point for this fight. And that storyline is no longer in place because Sean Strickland beat Israel Adesanya. And then Dricus du Plessis beat Sean Strickland to become the UFC middleweight champion. And that was the main selling point of this fight, and that's why the stakes were so much higher 12, 16, 18 months ago, whatever it was. The stakes were so much higher back then because here's Dricus du Plessis, this guy who's said these things, and Israel Adesanya has taken offense to what he said. Israel Adesanya can get revenge on Dricus du Plessis, and Israel Adesanya can make Dricus du Plessis eat his words, however you want to put it, by making sure that Dricus du Plessis never gets the middleweight belt. If Israel Adesanya and Dricus du Plessis fight, and Israel Adesanya beats Dricus du Plessis, well, no one will have to worry about Dricus du Plessis being a real African or a true African champion or whatever, because he'll never be a champion. We don't have to have this debate on who's the real champion and who is the champion who is going to breathe the African air and all that stuff that Dricus du Plessis was talking about. We don't have to worry about any of that stuff if Israel Adesanya remains champion and never allows Dricus du Plessis to get his hands on the belt. But here we are with Dricus du Plessis defending the belt against Israel Adesanya, who's trying to reclaim the belt. That storyline no longer being on the table has really hurt this fight because that was some of the appeal to a lot of fans. The best way for Israel Adesanya to get revenge on Dricus du Plessis is to remain champion. It'll be a double whammy. He'll beat Dricus du Plessis within the sport. You know, he'll get a win over him, he'll retain his title, all that stuff. But then it'll be like kicking him when he's down, the fact that, hey, as long as I'm around, you're never going to be champion. That's a tough pill to swallow if you're Dricus du Plessis. You've made these claims. Some of the claims that Dricus du Plessis has made have been taken out of context. Some of the original wording that he used has been taken out of context. But here we are with this grudge match. Regardless of what's been said, the appeal of that fight is him having to answer for what he said, but he's already got the belt. he doesn't really have to answer for anything now. He's the champion. That storyline is gone. The stakes of this fight are the same that they are for all grudge matches. I don't like you, you don't like me. Every grudge match that's ever taken place in the UFC, it's been something like that. Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones. Jon Jones really didn't have a problem with Daniel Cormier originally. Daniel Cormier had the problem with Jon Jones, and then eventually it became Jon Jones's problem. That's kind of how people have viewed this fight. If you're on the side of Dricus du Plessis, you view it as Dricus du Plessis never had a problem with Israel Adesanya. Israel Adesanya has a problem with Dricus du Plessis based on stuff he said in the past, and that's why they're going to fight, and that's why there's this heat. If you're on the side of Israel Adesanya never had any problem with Dricus du Plessis, but when Dricus du Plessis said what he said, now Israel Adesanya has a problem with him. If you're in the camp of du Plessis, you view Adesanya as the villain. If you're an Adesanya fan, you view du Plessis as the villain. That's good stuff. That's a good storyline. That's what makes this fight an anticipated matchup. But Dricus du Plessis doesn't have to answer for anything he said because he's already got the belt. Regardless of how people want to look at him, he'll always be remembered as a UFC champion. So that whole who's the true champion and all that stuff, that really isn't on the table anymore. Because if du Plessis beats Adesanya, he was already the champion. It really doesn't matter. And if Adesanya beats du Plessis will always be remembered as a UFC champion. Now, he never defended the title, which won't make him be remembered as a great champion, but he'll be remembered as a champion. There's that whole old saying of, you're not a champion until you defend the title. Well, that sounds good on paper, but that's false. You are the champion, it's just that you can't be considered a great champion until you defend the title. There's no such thing as a great champion with 0 title defenses. That's one of the knocks on Conor McGregor. Yeah, he's a 2-division champion. Yeah, he was champion in the UFC, but he never defended any of his belts. So Dricus du Plessis might not be remembered as a great champion if he loses at UFC 305, but he'll always be remembered as a guy who held the belt. So that storyline and one of the main selling points of this fight is no longer on the table. Had this fight taken place a long time ago when it was supposed to take place, before du Plessis got injured and before Adesanya dropped the title to Sean Strickland, and then Dricus du Plessis beat Sean Strickland, that was the most relevant point of this fight. That was the whole point of this fight. From a certain point of view, that's really the perfect way for Adesanya really to stick it to Dricus du Plessis is to, not only are you not the true African champion, not only are you not the real African champion, you're not even a UFC champion. You're making all these claims, you don't even have the belt, and you will never have the belt as long as I'm here. Do you see how much more interesting that story is? But of course, when Adesanya loses to Strickland, that goes out the window. But like I mentioned earlier, the stakes of this fight are still very high because du Plessis still has pressure on him. He's the champion, so he wants to keep that title belt because he wants to remain champion, and also there's pay-per-view points. There's money at stake for him. So he wants to keep the belt. He wants to continue to be champion. So there's pressure on him from that. Then there's pressure on him because here's a guy who is out looking for blood. He really wants to hurt du Plessis. Adesanya really wants to embarrass this guy. So there's pressure on du Plessis not to get embarrassed. So there's high stakes for du Plessis. But of course, all the pressure in a roundabout way is on Adesanya. Because yes, du Plessis doesn't want to get embarrassed, but Adesanya equally as much as du Plessis doesn't want to get embarrassed. He doesn't want to go in there, especially with his last performance being so bad against Sean Strickland. He doesn't want to go in there and lay an egg again, and he doesn't want to get beaten by a guy he doesn't like. So the stakes are still very, very high between these two guys. Adesanya has to prove that he's still the same guy that he was when he was the champion, and he has to erase the bad memory of the Strickland fight, so there's high stakes for him, and then Du Plessis wants to remain champion and not get embarrassed by a guy who doesn't like him. So the stakes are very, very high for this fight, and this is a fight that I really want to see because I love these kinds of fights. I love fights that are grudge matches. I love fights where I have no idea who's going to win this fight. Honest to God's truth, I have no idea who's going to win this fight. On a side note, one thing that I don't hope happens is when we get what usually happens in these bad blood grudge matches, which is a lot of circling, a lot of standing around with very little action. I really hope that doesn't happen. I really hope we don't get Adesanya versus Yoel Romero, one of the worst title fights in the history of the UFC. I hope the Yoel Romero fight doesn't take place at UFC 305. I hope we get either a knockout, a submission, something like that, or we get Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum, where two guys are being pushed to the limit and it comes down to the final round, and whoever wins that round wins the fight. I'm hoping we get something like that. But anyways, that's my opinion. You've heard my opinion. You've heard what I've had to say on this topic. Now I want to hear from you. Sound off in the comments section below. Like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.